is a 2013 Dodge SRT Viper, and it rocks. Like other Viper models, this one has a manual transmission mated to V10 power, and this one has 640 horses. Unlike other Vipers, though, this one has a level of refinement that previous Viper models, well, they just didn't have. And that makes a lot of people prefer this generation of the Viper to all the earlier models. And today I'm going to review this 5th gen SRT Viper and tell you what I think, and I'll show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this SRT Viper is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is the upscale GTS model with the rare GTS Laguna interior package. No modifications and just over 25,000 miles. This is a nice 5th gen Viper and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Viper where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, time for the quirks and features of the 5th gen Viper. Technically, the SRT Viper. This car came from an era they were really trying to push SRT, the performance brand, and so for a couple of years there, they didn't call it the Dodge Viper. It was the SRT Viper officially, but everybody kept calling it the Dodge Viper, and so eventually they just switched the name back. But this is technically an SRT Viper, and this model, this Viper generation, came out for 2013, and it was a big deal because the previous Viper generation had left after 2010. So this wasn't just a Viper redesign, it was a revival. We all were fearful that the Viper was gone for good after the 4th gen model ended, and then this thing showed up, the Viper was back, and it was nicer. The goal for this Viper was more refinement and more luxury. The Viper had developed a reputation in previous models for being unrefined and rowdy and hard to control and tough to drive and all these brutal things. But Dodge wanted to change that with this model, to make it more refined, more luxurious, and more expensive. And by making it nicer, also to offer more personalization options, colors, stitching, customization, things that other manufacturers were making a lot of money with. Chrysler saw that, they had the Viper, they figured we can do that, and so that was the purpose of this Viper. More money, more refined, more luxury, and more profit through all these customization features. But even though this Viper wasn't quite as Viper-like as previous Vipers, it still had the main thing that makes a Viper, the V10. In this car, it was an 8.4-liter V10, absolutely massive powertrain, naturally aspirated like the other Viper V10s, and here it made 640 horsepower, absolutely brutal. And performance was crazy too, 0 to 60 in the mid 3-second range onto a top speed above 200 miles an hour. This may have been the tamer Viper, but it had more performance credentials than any Viper that came before. And despite Chrysler's insistence that this was the luxury Viper, there were some indications that that may not have been true. Like, for example, the hood latch was still on the outside of the car. To open up the hood, you stick your hand inside this panel where the hood meets the front fender, and there's a latch in there. You pull it, that pops the hood open, and then you can just open it up the rest of the way. There was not a hood latch in the driver's footwell, and you could even open up the hood if the car was completely locked. Now, this was also true of previous Viper models, but obviously it's a feature of unrefined, ridiculous cars. You'd think they would have changed it for the luxury Viper, but they didn't. This was still a Viper. And next up in this vicinity, you will also notice on the front fender a badge that says GTS. And this badge is actually a pretty big deal because when the 5th gen Viper came out, it was offered in 2 versions. There was a base model. That was for people who liked the old school rowdiness of the Viper, who didn't want to let go of the sort of engine strapped to a chassis and that's all you got feel of the early Viper models. Those cars were stripped down, not very luxurious, with a starting price of around $100,000. Or for an extra $25,000, you could step up to the GTS. And that's this car. And the GTS was supposed to be the luxury, refined, high-end, upmarket version of the Viper that added some sophistication and class and high-end materials and upscale touches compared to that base model and compared to other Vipers that came before. Now, there were quite a few differences between the base model raw Viper and the upscale GTS, and I'll go through more of them shortly, especially in the interior. That's where they primarily are. But my very favorite difference between the two was on the outside, and it was the hood. The base model had a hood with 6 different air vents for cooling the engine. 6 of them, 3 on each side, looking muscle car powerful. The GTS got a totally different hood with only 2 air vents. It was supposed to be a more luxurious thing, something you could take to a nice restaurant. You didn't need 6 vents there looking like you're driving a muscle car. You had a refined luxury car, and so you had fewer hood vents to help illustrate that point, or so they thought. But anyway, beyond that, let's talk through the rest of the interesting exterior quirks and features, starting with the overall design, style, proportions of this car. It looks really nice, and it looks unmistakably like a Viper. It has a lot of the typical Viper design cues, specifically the long hood in front covering up that giant powertrain, the passenger compartment all pushed back basically on top of the rear wheel, the double bubble roof. It certainly looks very Viperish, although in keeping with kind of the ethos of this car, it does look more modernized and more refined compared to maybe the more raw, basic, unfinished look of earlier Viper models. The 5th gen was certainly like a Viper in nicer clothes. And yet, there were still some exterior Easter eggs. My favorite is the 3rd brake light, which is the Viper logo. You press on the brakes, brake lights come on each side, and the Viper logo lights up in the center. That was your legally required 3rd brake light, was the Viper logo lighting up when you press the brakes. That was something that they had done on a previous Viper years earlier, and they reprised it for this car. The Viper logo as the brake lights, a pretty cool touch. Also interesting in the back, you take a close look at that Viper logo and you'll notice it's actually different from previous Viper logos. And indeed, that was something that Dodge kind of quietly did when coming out with these cars. The Viper logo would change with each major generation. So the 5th gen model, this car got a completely different Viper logo compared to the others. The basics were the same, the shape, the size, there was a snake in it, but it always looked a little different, and that's true here as well. Now, also interesting on the outside, maybe the most interesting quirk, there's a vent behind the front windows, which is normally there in mid-engine cars to get air into the engine, but this is a front-engine car, so what's that there for? Turns out, brake cooling. That vent had a duct inside of it that would send air down to the rear brakes in order to cool them. You don't often see a rear brake cooling duct mounted up there, but this car had it. Also interesting and kind of quirky was the door handles. You walk up and they're not traditional door handles. Instead, you push down on this panel and it electronically pops the door open. These days, we're all pretty used to electronic door poppers, but this was a pretty cool idea back in the day, and it gave the Viper a little extra character and maybe some fun and excitement when you opened up the door. And next we move inside the SRT Viper, and when you get in here, you can clearly see what made the GTS model, the luxury version, and just in general, why the 5th gen Viper was a nicer place to be than previous Viper models. In fact, this GTS is particularly nice because it has the GTS Laguna interior package, which was a pretty rare option that classed things up to the highest possible level. And you can see this gorgeous sort of brown leather all over the dashboard and the seats. Looks very nice. The seats themselves have this beautiful diamond stitching in the center center, almost looks like a worn baseball mitt. It's just perfect. There's contrast stitching all over the interior, the door panels, the dashboard, the center. Everything in here looks really nice from a materials perspective. This was a luxury car just like they were hoping for. At least when you looked around in here, you saw the materials, the colors, everything. It looked like the Viper had finally gone luxury. But then you really looked closer and you started to wonder. When you open the door, for example, you can see the silver Viper sill plate. Looks pretty cool, and it's held on with exposed screws. Not exactly the classiest operation. Also on the door sill, you can see the warning label for the exhaust, because even though this was the refined luxury Viper, the exhaust still came out the sides and it could still burn you when you were getting in and out of the car. That was a Viper hallmark from the old days, burnt legs, and so they kept it even on the luxury Viper. And of course, the exhaust sounds pretty good. Big old V10 roar. Let's take a listen. Inside, the problem with luxurifying the Viper was that Chrysler wasn't really making a luxury car in this era, and so a lot of the switchgear, buttons, knobs reflect that. For instance, the climate controls in the center are all kind of cheap-looking plastic. They don't match the interior color, and they don't look particularly nice. Same deal with the buttons on the steering wheel, which looked like they came straight out of a Dodge Neon, or Dodge Dart, I guess it would have been at the time. It's also true of the power window switches and power mirrors, and probably the worst offender of all was the turn signal stalk, also the windshield wiper control, which really just looked rental car cheap. The Viper's interior had clearly come a long way from those earlier Viper models, but there were still some things holding it back, particularly at this car's price point. Like I said, $125 for a base level GTS, that equates to about $170,000 with inflation in today's money. You add in the Laguna interior package and you're pushing 200 grand. In today's money, that's a lot to spend if you're getting cheap plastic stalks and buttons in the luxury Viper. But anyway, onto the quirks and features of this interior, starting with the grab handle over on the passenger side. You can see it here, and it really left no question when you climbed in the vehicle about what this car's purpose was. Yeah, it might have been nicer, but you still had to hold on. I also like that hidden in the climate control buttons, there's a button for street suspension and a separate button for race suspension, and you can switch back and forth at will with just the simple push of a button. You don't have to go into some complex menu to change drive modes. You just press street or you press race, just like you might be adjusting the temperature. They figured you'd be doing it that often. And in fact, that adjustable suspension was a benefit of the GTS. Beyond the luxury interior, you also got Bilstein Road and Track suspension, which was intended to make the drive not only more comfortable, but also sharper when you were in track mode. Other benefits of the GTS also went beyond the luxury interior. You had added sound deadening to try to make it quieter in here, in case you wanted that from your Viper, and you also had an improved stereo compared to the standard base level model to give you a more fun sound experience. They really did try to improve basically everything about the GTS to make it better. But back to our interesting quirks, how about the launch control button, which is mounted right here on the steering wheel next to the cruise control buttons. I love that. They figured you're going to want to use launch control just as much as cruise control. And they decided to prioritize launch control over a stereo volume control. Like in other Chrysler models from this era, the stereo volumes are hidden behind the steering wheel, which is a brilliant idea. You can reach around and tap them to turn it up or down, change the track over on the other side. It was great, but that meant that launch control was indeed more accessible than turning down or up the stereo, which just seems so perfectly Viper. And another nod to a more refined, more grown-up Viper, you can see in the center console, there are cup holders. Two of them. Earlier Vipers didn't have that. You also have a slew of power ports back here, a 12-volt USB, even a slot for an SD card, and there's a little pop-up panel right here. You push this, and a cigarette lighter outlet pops up for more charging, which is also helpful. So some nice Viper refinements. In fact, there was even a little storage compartment between the seats. You can see a GTS badge on it and this little clip that you could open up and then put stuff in there, which added a little bit more practicality to this interior. Most automakers that do this do it instead of a glove box, but this car had that too. A nice little glove box with a nice little button you would push to open. So there were some nice storage compartments in here. Unfortunately, though, you still had the parking brake, this absolutely massive thing right in the center. No attempt to go electric, no attempt to hide it or even kind of put it on the side. It was right in the middle because this was still a Viper. And for more proof of that, you go to turn on the reading lights mounted on the ceiling in this Alcantara headliner, and look how much the headliner moves when you're trying to turn on the reading lights. This was again intended to be more luxury, but still a Chrysler and still a Viper, so they didn't quite nail the luxury thing. With all that in mind, we should talk infotainment, which is a touchscreen. Obviously, by today's standards, not a particularly good one, but back in the day, this was a pretty good touchscreen. It won't have your modern features like pinch to zoom or swiping, but it is relatively responsive, it is relatively high quality, and it's fairly intuitive. This was actually one of the better infotainment systems in its era, this Chrysler Uconnect that went into this car. Still, it's a little backwards, not the highest quality. The backup camera really does not look nice, but at least this car has one, and it also has performance pages. You can go into the SRT performance pages and pull up a multitude of different, well, performance pages. Like for instance, this timer that would let you time a quarter mile, an eighth mile, 0 to 60, whatever you wanted. You also had access to auxiliary gauges in here that would show various things you wouldn't see in the normal gauge cluster in case you wanted to keep an eye on some specific metric, you were trying something, you were at the track, whatever. You could also see your G-forces here, which was always pretty cool, and get your real-time power and torque numbers all in your performance pages. And since we're talking about screens, let's move into the gauge cluster, which was surprisingly also a screen. Most of it was analog. The parts on the left and right sides are all analog, but in the center, you did have a screen, and the coolest thing was this screen had its own performance pages. And so here, you could also measure a quarter mile or an eighth mile, and you can see it set up actually like a drag strip orientation, which is really cool. Also in here, the other stuff that you would have found in that center display screen moved to the gauge cluster, like your G-forces. You can see real-time or all-time best. You can also see extra gauges in here that display various information, and once again, real-time horsepower and torque numbers now shown directly below your line of sight. That was one of the big benefits of going digital for the gauge cluster. You could have that stuff in there. Now, the gauge cluster also does a few other important things, like for instance, it'll show a trip odometer, it'll show various other vehicle information you might need or want, but to me, having the performance pages right there in your line of sight is the coolest thing about this gauge cluster, and one of the cooler things about this SRT Viper in general. And finally, we move on to the cargo area, although it's not particularly interesting. You open up the tailgate, you can see the cargo area, which is pretty much about the sizing that you would expect for a vehicle like this. It's decent size for bags. It's not huge. It's not overly practical, but it's probably big enough for the kind of luggage you would want to bring on the kind of trip where you would want to bring your Viper. But with all of that in mind, let's talk about what happened after this car. Well, the 5th gen Viper came out. The Viper was back. Everybody was excited, and then it didn't sell. It was not really a success from basically day one. It wasn't finding a lot of buyers, in part because the Viper had always been this rough, rowdy thing, and Chrysler had tried to position it like a more luxurious car at a higher price point, and that just didn't speak to Viper buyers, and it didn't seem to attract a lot of Porsche 911 buyers either. Eventually, Dodge leaned into the Viper's performance image a bit more, and they came out with some really special high-performance versions of this car. The very best Viper models of all are some of the performance versions of the 5th gen Viper. But As good as those were, and as expensive as those were, they were rare. You're never going to sell those in massive numbers, and so you sold a few. They were limited, they were special, they sold quickly, but they didn't exactly save the Viper. And in the end, the 5th gen Viper went out of production after the 2017 model year with only about 2,400 units sold. It is a very rare car, rarer in fact than the 05 Ford GT. And the Viper has never come back since, and I suspect it probably won't. A hallmark of the Viper is that big V10, and it's hard to imagine in today's world of emissions and fuel economy regulations, even under the Trump administration, that you're going to see a V10 return to a production car, particularly when sales weren't that strong of the last Viper they did. Still, for a lot of people, this was the high water mark of the Viper, the most powerful, the most refined, the best Viper ever. And with that in mind, let's see what I think. I get behind the wheel and drive it. All right, driving the SRT Viper, the 5th gen Viper. This is tremendously interesting for me because I owned a 97 Viper, technically a 2nd gen car. And everybody called those first 4 generations of Viper crude and rough and, you know, very like body bolted to an engine, just like not much else to it. And so I've always kind of been curious what the 5th gen Viper is like. And the only one I've driven, I think, is an ACR briefly for a video a long time ago. And so I was curious, especially about this one, because not only is this a 5th gen Viper, which was supposed to be more luxurious and comfortable and nicer, quieter, but it's also a GTS, which is supposed to be like the especially luxurious and comfortable and quiet version. And even 2 minutes in this car, into driving this car, and I'm aware this is still a Viper. I thought that this car would have been super tamed and toned down in order to get it at the price level that they wanted to, and in order to hit kind of what they were hoping to achieve with this era of Viper, which was like just a more comfortable, luxurious car that they could sell big money and options and all that. And I've always assumed, based on reading about this car, that it was going to be a lot more toned down and tame. And that's what the article said in period. Well, I'm driving this thing and it does not at all feel toned down and tame. The V10 is obviously the centerpiece of any Viper, but in this car, it is just as raucous as it is in every other Viper. It rumbles. You know, I'm sitting at a stoplight, you can feel the rumble through the gear shifter. You hear the sound at basically all RPMs. When you start it, you hear it kind of flutter in there, like it is rumbling. It is a rumbly engine. The transmission is still heavy clutch, heavy notches into gear. It's not like some smooth Porsche or BMW transmission that was refined and relaxed in order to make, you know, this luxury Viper. The sound is still very much like a big old angry V10. The ride is still like a rough, loud, you know, stuff is rattling kind of ride. This is still a Viper, and I feel like I've been lied to now about the 5th gen Viper my entire life. It honestly feels with this Viper like they just sort of luxurified and dressed up another earlier Viper. To me, it does not feel that much more luxurious. It does not feel that much more coddling. Now, this is not a bad thing. I actually think one of the reasons the Viper, the final generation Viper, this car, failed to be as successful as earlier models is because they tried to tame it a little bit. And they tried to market it as a tamed car, and they tried to price it like a tamed car. And that's not what people wanted. People wanted a car that was just basically graduation from the Corvette. And this car, to me, is actually that. It's like a louder, rougher, more exotic Corvette. But Dodge really tried to go after the options crowd and the specking crowd, which was becoming really popular in 13, 14, 15 when this car was like being sold in big numbers. And they wanted to try to get some of those dollars for themselves. The Viper crowd never really embraced the luxury thing. And this car just doesn't have the feel of like a real luxury car. Like, yeah, it's got some nice leather and some contrast stitching. The materials are clearly nicer than what you get in my 97 Viper or any other Viper, but this is not a luxury car. It in no part feels like it. It rides rough, it's loud, it's got a rumbly engine. The gear and transmission situation is not luxury car at all. The visibility, I mean, this is still a burbling old school exotic. And I actually think that's better for the Viper, because that's what people think of when they think of the Viper. And I think that Dodge trying to go away from that really wasn't the best plan. And as I'm driving this car, it turns out they didn't even do a very good job of actually going away from it. It was purely marketing. I will say one thing that I do love about this Viper, I just recently drove a 3rd gen and a 2nd gen for this channel, for 1.5 gen. Those cars were really a seat and an engine. This car is more refined than that. It does give you the opportunity to get into a Viper and get some of the exotic feel, like the big V10 and the loud, rough ride and the feel of it all, with a little bit more tame driving experience. And by the way, I should point out, this car also feels like it steers and handles a lot better than other Vipers. It feels a lot more planted and solid and stable in that sense. It's also a lot newer. Technology had advanced a lot. This car has low miles. It feels like a modern, much more modern experience. The steering is tighter, more predictable. The handling is more predictable. But nonetheless, I'm still terrified to floor it, which is a feeling I don't get in an R8, a Gallardo, a Huracan, you know, all these other cars that had V10s that were made in the same era. Like, this car is still a hairy-chested brute car. It honestly, what it reminds me of is like when a professional athlete finally retires and is forced to get like a real job. You know, it's like you pitched for a couple of years, you washed out of the majors, and then you have to go like work at an insurance agency. That's what this Viper's like. Like, you're still an athlete, you're still like bulked up, but you're just toned down a little, but it's all still there, and it feels like that. With the exception of steering and handling, which really do feel much more solid, much more improved, and just significantly better than what you found in the old Vipers, which were really kind of difficult cars to control, and you had to be working at it pretty much all the time. And so that's the SRT Viper, the 5th gen Viper. This is a special car with big power and performance, manual transmission like all the old school Vipers, but a little bit more refinement and luxury and improvements in steering and handling that the other Vipers didn't have. This is the Viper, the ultimate, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. And now it's time to give this Viper a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 60 out of 100, which puts the SRT Viper here against rivals. It does well, but it doesn't jump up into the upper echelon of European cars like the Audi R8, Ferrari California, or Mercedes-AMG GT or SLS, which I think is where Chrysler was hoping it would land. The truth is, even the 5th gen Viper is just too unruly for the daily scores to get into that range. It's not refined enough, just a bit too rumbly, a bit too much of a handful. I think that's great. It's what makes the Viper cool, but they were definitely trying to get it into a bit more of a luxury car with this generation, and they didn't quite get there. It's still an awesome car, and maybe the best all-around Viper.